What makes us human? Genes alone can't tell the whole story. Over the last 2 million years, we shaped tools, cultures, ideas, even reshaped landscapes. At the Human Evolution and Archaeological Sciences Network, we study all of it. Our team brings together evolutionary anthropology, archaeology, genetics, paleontology, isotope physics, geology, and more. In short, if it helps us understand where we come from, we've got an expert boat. Funded through the University of Vienna, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and supported by the Natural History Museum of Vienna, we connect world-class research with new methods, from ancient DNA to digital archaeology. Our aim is to push the boundaries of knowledge, foster collaborations across disciplines and borders, and inspire the next generation of scientists. And we don't just stay in the lab. Through talks, public events, and an active online presence, we share our findings with a wider audience. Because a human evolution is a story that belongs to all of us. HEAS is about excellence, curiosity, and collaboration. Join us as we explore our shared past and what it means for our shared future.
Okay, so some applause for So welcome to another HEAS talk, so that you're all aware of what our framework is. And let me start by introducing our fantastic speaker today. And we're, well, actually quite lucky that he has sabbatical in these months. And we have the chance now to welcome Ian Kuijt, one of the, let's say, famous Neolithic and pre-Neolithic experts worldwide and in the Near East in particular. He has several interests, yeah. So and he has a quite long CV, which is not surprising when you think of let me check how many books, more than 7 books and more than 100 research papers. So you can imagine how many things he was involved in and is still involved in. He's professor for anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. Actually, he's originally Canadian, and he did his bachelor in the University of Lethbridge before he moved on with his master's at the Simon Fraser University, still in Canada, and then moved to Harvard, where he did his master first in the early 90s, and then did a PhD with Ofer Bar Yosef, one of the great, brilliant minds in Near Eastern archaeology. Again, his PhD in anthropology at the Harvard University. So he had quite a, let's say, mobile time as a young postdoc, where he was lecturer in Lethbridge, in Berkeley, in Harvard, in Tufts and Brandeis, both in the area of Boston, what I have learned today. And his interests are quite, let's say, far-reaching, by means of data-driven, on the one hand, talking about and thinking about demography, village life, the transformation from foragers to farmers on the one hand, but he also works with, he's also working with historical archaeology in British Columbia and in Ireland, actually. And I think also quite interesting for us is his engagement in heritage studies, in cultural heritage, and we will have a second talk by Ian this week on Thursday, organized by Bianca Danner in the Fragile Heritage series, not announced yet, but it's this Thursday at 5 in the afternoon. Well, what else? He's quite interested in connecting the interface between visual narratives, film narratives, with histories of sites and places. And this is, I think, also quite an interesting angle for making archaeology in the future. However, we are happy to welcome today Ian Kuijt. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for coming, to being here this afternoon. I wanted to start off by saying thanks to Barbara and for that warm introduction. It's one of those eclectic things when you hear an introduction about yourself on that level. And what I was told as a graduate student years and years ago, I had a faculty member, he was the chair of the department actually, where I was doing my master's in Canada. And he came up to me and he said, when are you going to settle down? As in, when are you going to only focus in one area? I was working in British Columbia, Canada at the time, on hunter-gatherers. And I realized over the years that in some ways that would have been really good academic advice. But on the other hand, I found that I've ended up pursuing a lot of different ideas in different ways. And it is one of those strange benefits of being at a university at times, is that we can explore, as they said here in that very good promo, by the way, the human career in different ways. So I want to talk today on a couple different levels, and I want to think about some of the different dimensions here. In many ways, stepping back from conversations, detailed conversations about data and about very specific things, and in some ways to re-engage with the question of what is the Neolithic, at least in the context of the Near East. And I should point out right off that the big thing I want to leave you with is that there is no one Neolithic, there are multiple Neolithics depending on where you're dealing with. So that's a sort of one phrase to think about right off. And the big thing I want to really think about today is both reconsidering what is the Neolithic, but also in some ways thinking about what this tells us and how to think about different things, especially related to the evolutionary transition from what I'm calling to self-insurance, and to think about risk management. So I want to, in some ways, dance away from this little thing called data. That's not entirely true, but I want to think in terms of how do we blend data with ideas in some form. To do this, I'm going to shamelessly use this as a foundation. This was a great talk from the Chemi. In June, I don't remember anymore, July, when he gave his presentation from Istanbul, gave it here, but he's of course from Istanbul. And this was one of the slides that he used, which was it was a very rich, detailed, descriptive account of the Neolithic in terms of Anatolia, especially more, Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, these kinds of pieces. But this is one slide that really caught my eye, because in this, he talked about sort of what are the commonalities of large villages. Things such as new food sources, pottery and other new technologies, food storage and distribution, craft specialization, property exchange, and technology. This is unquestionably, and the reason why I sort of triggered this and decided to go with this was that I had developed a slide that was very similar to this. The only layers I added were population, and when I saw his, I realized that most of my conversation is one of thinking about how do we drill down. And the specific thing I want to drill down into is related to food storage and distribution. Less distribution, but really thinking about food storage and risk and planning. And thinking about that. So using this as an opportunity to drill down and think about, in some ways, what I'm going to refer to as the sort of the analysis of carrying capacity, and I'll come back and define this in a bit, thinking about population density, the ability to store food, and dealing with food insecurity. And that's really where I want to go as we sort of think about some of the different pieces here as we think about the evolutionary foundation. Now to do that, we have to, of course, think about multiple variables. Multiple variables, not burials, variables. And here I want to sort of draw together and bring a number of things together, including thinking about seasonality, as expressed here, thinking about population, thinking about carrying capacity, and thinking about how some of these are interconnected, and in a way that we as researchers don't really have these integrative conversations at times. And I want to try and think through how some of these are connected, how in some ways this, at least in my context, is nudging me to rethink some of what I've written, abandon what I've written in some particular cases, and to rethink what is it to be Neolithic in different forms. One of the big questions behind this is an awkward question and that is, was the Neolithic Revolution actually a revolution? This is, in some ways, a heretical question, because the foundation of the Neolithic and of sort of researchers working with the Neolithic is really one of a progressive narrative. It's one that goes directly from Kuijt and Child as one scholar, but other scholars as well. It is really thinking about the Neolithic as an evolutionary threshold that is progressive, that takes us in certain directions. And that, in some ways, whether we deal with it explicitly or implicitly in our writing, that is a performative background that we think about at different points. So the question really, from my standpoint, is, the answer is, yes it is, and no it's not. The question really comes back to, was it a revolution? That depends on time. That depends whether you want to think about the Neolithic in longue durée and periods of thousands of years. Oh, I'm sorry. And the microphone is here? Okay. Sure.
Yes, would be better.
Okay.
Around the neck?
Sure. Okay. Sounds very formal. Is this going to work?
Then you can move.
Yes, I'm a walker.
Yes, I saw that.
You noticed that now? I should have told you in advance. All right. Does that work? Okay. I assume you were getting some comments about that. All right. So the answer to the question here, in many ways, is how we think about time. Is it a matter that we think about it in terms of, was the Neolithic a revolution vis-a-vis daily life? Was it a revolution vis-a-vis long-term in the context of a couple generations? Was it something that was revolutionary in terms of thousands of years? Those are different ways of thinking about the Neolithic. And from my standpoint, it is revolutionary when you want to think about it in terms of thousands of years, but it is not revolutionary when you want to think about it intergenerationally. And so it really depends on time when we want to think about that kind of an argument. This, of course, and I'll just deal with this one very quickly, this, of course, really depends, it comes back to the sort of historic perspective from different individuals and thinking about what is the Neolithic. It is one that is very much a macro argument. Kuijt and Child's argument is, of course, a macro position from a broad evolutionary standpoint. And it's a very different way to think about it. It's a fundamental way to think about it in different ways. The idea that he put forth is essentially a progressive narrative of a revolution, the Neolithic Revolution, an urban revolution, and that of some form of industrial revolution, and connecting these together as a progressive narrative. Hidden behind that is, in some ways, the argument for improvement as well. He didn't use that framing, but that is the subtext to a lot of that in different ways. I want to turn that around. And I want to think not in terms of sort of this macro perspective, I want to think in terms of the grassroots in this particular case. And thinking about it from the standpoint of how do we think about from the ground up, looking at some of the different pieces and how this may fit together. So let me start by thinking about population levels and population pressure. And here I'm going to be direct with you as I go through this presentation. I'm going to try and connect you to a bunch of literature. I'm going to make arguments that are summations of that literature. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing for specific things. I'm going to direct you to that literature, so if you wish to access it, you can do that. And instead what I want to do is to think in terms of what's the big abstraction that we take from that. So, Neolithic population levels. An awful lot of conversation relates to the assumption that buildings equal a high number of buildings, many buildings equal a form of high population levels, and that there is some form of a near urban environment in some capacity. I'm going to push that to the side for a little bit, the sort of the near urban, and that's a different conversation in some ways. What I want to do is really outline for you that in many ways that our understanding, which comes from some of this early scholarship, now needs to be rescaled in terms of population numbers. And we need to think in terms of re-examining some of the different pieces to that. And if you let me know when I can advance slides.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think it should work.
okay. Let me try that again.
No?
Yes, thank you. So, historical, I'm going to use Çatalhöyük, and this is related to some work that I've done with Eric Machiniak quite recently. And this is thinking in terms of historical accounts from the original researchers, James Mellert at Çatal, and then moving through time in terms of these different numbers. The argument I'm going to make to you is that in some way, the estimates that have been generated in terms of population levels for Çatalhöyük are essentially inherited. They are inherited from the standpoint of V. Gordon Childe, who developed expectations in terms of the Neolithic and urban revolution. His original work was where he made publications of 8,000 to 10,000. At later points, he scales it back from 5,000 to 7,000. But that's essentially where the conversation has stayed for a long period of time. And the argument I'm going to make to you is that in some ways, this has been adopted from V. Gordon Childe to Mellert, from Mellert down to Ian Hodder and other researchers. And then in some ways, this kind of absorption, this historical recency in different ways, is more a phantom of, more a phenomenon of what previous people have said, rather than actually saying, how do we know what we know? To be perfectly frank, and I say this with all due respect to James Mellert here, that number is based essentially on a piece of paper that was written, where somebody had written it out on a piece of paper. It was a number that was pulled out. It was not a number that was generated in terms of looking at the total site size, the number of buildings, the kind of metrics we think about today, which are absolutely critical. It was largely based on, there's a lot of buildings, and this is a super cool site. And how do we explain this? There must have been basically a giant covering of buildings where people lived. And on the basis of that, he said, how many? Let's call it 8 to 10,000. That's where the number comes from. And that largely, with the exception of Craig Sesford's excellent work, that number has largely stayed the same, even if it's been fine-tuned in different points. So there's a series of, so the estimates are historical estimates, not necessarily based on methods that we feel comfortable with, people that can feel comfortable with in some capacity. These are some of the assumptions that are based on this. Part of it comes from this view up here. I'm going to make the argument to you that if you want to pick one particular photograph, one particular illustration that's been created more problems in terms of Neolithic demography, you can't go better than 1967 figure 12. This one in the upper right that anybody who does Neolithic work has essentially looked at. And the simple reason why is from 1967 onwards, this became the mentality. This became the visual guide for how we think about population. And that is, it's a series of integrated buildings that are connected together, that are well preserved, with people living happy lives in each one of them. That's not an ethnographic village. If you want to think about Carol Kramer's work in Afghanistan, in Iraq or Iran, that's not an ethnographic village. That is an idealization based on architecture. And it's been perpetuated in terms of other views such as this, which is essentially one of well-maintained row housing. This is a very different view, one that Mike Charles and Amy Bogart have published and that we've borrowed in our publication, which is really one of clusters of buildings and thinking about spaces between them. That's a very different way to look at things. Here's another element to it. This is looking at Patty Jo Watson's work from the 1970s. She did some extraordinary work. Her and Carol Kramer did some absolutely extraordinary work looking at ethnographic villages. And what we know now is that if these are the floor plans that you see here in some capacity, what you can see here with the different colors, these are different biological families. So the green family, the blue family, the reddish pink, I don't know what color we're going to call that. These are where the families are connected. The figures you see in those boxes are the building number, the number of adults, the number of children, their names, their kinship, and also that of the age associated there. There's several different things you should take away from this. One, look at the mosaic nature that's coming out of it. Those are the inhabited buildings. The other buildings may be roofed, but nobody is living there. They're being used for storing food, for agricultural equipment, etc. The second part to it is look at the mosaic in terms of families are not all tightly connected together. They're spread across the village in different ways. Also look at the number of people that live in different buildings. Some of them have one adult, some have 5, some have 4. The list goes on. And I've just taken one small section, if you see in the lower left, I've just taken one small section of this to try and look at that as a piece of research. So the point out of this is what's going on in lived villages today. 1970s anyways. I see no reason to suggest that villages in the Neolithic were any different than this. This, from my standpoint, makes sense. So where does that leave us? Well, what Eric and I have done is, most recently in 2024, we went and borrowed this, the system that Craig Sesford had used, and we changed the assumptions that were built into this. We asked Craig about the assumptions, we went back and forth, he was very supportive about this, and this is the end product. And that is, if you look at average building use life, which is one of these critical variables in developing population estimates, if you look at the percentage of the mound that is covered by buildings, so a mosaic versus that of basically a blanket urban sprawl in some form, what you end up with is you end up with a population estimate of somewhere around 600 to 800 people. This is actually a handy thing because in here, in this particular publication, we went and developed a series of different scenarios. And it means that researchers can go back to it and say, right, my assumption is that 60% of the mound was covered and that buildings were used for 45 years. And that will give you a different population estimate. The point here is that it's nudging us no longer to pull out pieces of paper from our back pocket in the bar, write down a figure. It's a matter that now we're actually saying to ourselves, what assumptions am I using? And how can I support those? And therefore, what happens when I take those assumptions and pump them into a system that Craig Sesford at Chatham has used? So the idea of being there is really to nudge some of our colleagues to be explicit about this. I think the other part to it is there's a lot less people living in various Neolithic settlements than the arguments that have been presented before. Here's one example of that. This is looking at a series of sites in the context of the Near East, in this particular case, the Southern Levant. And what you can see is the original publication framing that I did a number of years ago in 2000, which I deeply, deeply regret now because I think I was very wrong. What you can see then is in the green is what a rescaled population estimate would be. So this is a different Neolithic. This is not a Neolithic, and I feel comfortable with this. This is in some ways a more exciting and interesting Neolithic, but it's also a Neolithic that is probably not driven by population pressure and crowding in some form. And that's important when we start thinking about what is the Neolithic in some capacity. Let's think about some other elements. If that is the population, how are they storing food and how are they using food? Food storage is critical in terms of the Neolithic. It's also one that we're not spending a lot of time thinking about, despite the fact that we recognize how the Neolithic was a period of time where there was the development of storage. And that includes everything from what's going on in the Neolithic, but also places, Aboriginal California, University of Michigan, American Southwest. This is a topic that's been engaged with by scholars in so many different places. What we learn when we start going back, and this is from a publication I did in 2017 in environmental archaeology, thinking in terms of what happens in the southern Levant in terms of change through time. And what we see is largely one of food going from being stored in extramural locations to one of more controlled access in intramural context, going inside. And then the other one is that of thinking about the aspects of scale and how that changes. So these two things going on. And this is a big one right here, as you can see the illustration to the right-hand side of where storage is taking place in the context of, certainly by the LPPNB in the southern Levant with the big villages. It's taking place in buildings that are in basements or sub-basement areas. So there's things that are taking place that sort of show us how this works. This is going to cause you a great deal of pain because of the number of illustrations here, but this is one that expands that conversation from the southern Levant. It's thinking in terms of extramural storage with the green line coming across, and then also that of volume, thinking about the red line, which is going from low volume storage of wild plants to high volume storage of what I've called managed plants. So thinking about this as a trajectory and thinking about some of the data points that we have. That's in many ways what that big picture you just saw is based on. This and a lot of other work that sort of draws that together. And this has been published in that 2017 piece that I told you about as well. So what I'm trying to leave you with here is that there are data to support this transition in terms of where people are living and how they are living together. Let's expand this, and let's think about foodscapes in the context of what I'm going to call shelf life, risk, and storage planning. One of the things right off is we don't, as researchers, we don't really talk about risk. We don't talk about planning goals. We don't talk about failure. We talk about the domestication and the morphological changes that take place with plants and animals. That's our bread and butter. For those that are working either with plants or with animals, really that's what we get paid to do historically, is to think in terms of when do we have morphological changes that are taking place, and therefore when do we have this celebrated event of domestication in some form. We rarely, with some exceptions, some of the work that Amy Bogart or some other people have done, we rarely think about risk, planning, and failure in some capacity. The point to all of this is that food storage is about time. It's totally about time. The big thing to get out of this in terms of planning is that when ethnographic groups today, and it doesn't matter where you're talking about geographically or historically in the last couple hundred years, all of this is about storage planning and creating a buffer. And the buffer is not just so that you're taking care of this year, it's a matter that you're taking care of the next 18 to 24 months. So this is a longer term game than we really give recognition for in some form. And that, some people would argue, that's a minimal target. In some cases, it's forward planning in terms of 3 years to try and sort of protect yourself. The other part to it is listed down below on the second last point here, is that we're only now starting to understand that spoilage rates are very, very high. In certain contexts, their 18% is absolutely nothing for a 1-year storage loss. In some cases, it's surprisingly high. So food storage, plant food storage, even under good conditions, is risky. It doesn't always mean that things are going to pay off for you in some form. And it means that, ultimately it means, as I'm going to hopefully demonstrate to you here, is that we have to think in terms of how do you store enough to get through things. Here's one of the big parts to it, and that is when we talk about the evolution of plant storage, we think about it in terms of gas pumps. We don't write about it in terms of refrigerators. We think about it in the context of food storage as a gas pump, and in our case, we talk about clay silos, or we talk about pits in some form, but we're really thinking about that in terms of spaces that are filled up, with some form of stable food. And then we talk about celebrated surpluses or something else. But we're really envisioning these spaces, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, as really being gas pumps rather than refrigerators. We all know what happens to refrigerators if we close the door and leave them for a month, let alone 4 months, and that is different things bake off. Different things go rotten in some form. And so you have this complex dimensions to these. And what I've been trying to do with some of this is to try and rethink some of that. And really, this comes down to thinking about a very simple graph. And that is, it turns out that there's a cutoff. Things go bad, or as the Brits would say, pear-shaped. Shit happens when you get to 13.5%. That's when things change. Now, that's not generated from me or others. That's shamelessly stolen from World Health Organization and from this wonderful, wonderful journal called the Journal of Stored Products Research. This is the most boring, dry journal you will ever see, where essentially it's one of, it is looked at in terms of commercial development, because they look in terms of what do you need to do to store plants in, whether it's corn in California or such and such, looking at how do you fumigate, how do you use chemicals, how do you use temperature. It is the driest and most brilliant journal ever. Journal of Stored Products Research. And this is one example, and that is, once you cross that line of 13.5%, you're into the zone of things not working. And that is, this is some brilliant work that was actually done in Africa, and that is looking at it in terms of long-term storage and where things go bad. 13.5% is, for all intents and purposes, the cutoff when you start looking at the literature. Here's the other thing. We're only now starting to understand that storage isn't a matter that you have the refrigerator and that you have a few things that go bad in there. You've all opened up containers of, I don't know, lettuce or something else, and you'll notice some of these are drippy and slimy, some of the pieces are, and other ones are quite all right. And if you want to spend the time, you can do that, pick those out. That's what's happening in the limited number of cases where we have research that's taken place. There's a French team, a German team, there's a few other groups that are dealing with this, more from a biological standpoint. From my interest, the thing is, we understand that there are certain zones that spoilage is taking place in certain areas. Basically works from the standpoint of the bottom is where things go soupy, and the side is where things go soupy. So what we know is that in these sort of pit features, let alone if it's in baskets up above the ground, that there are factors that change preservation, aeration, sort of with air coming through, oxygen-deprived environments, CO2-rich environments. We don't know how those work, but they have to be going on in some places. There's some fascinating work from the American Midwest at this point that has demonstrated that in some cases, ethnographic groups were lining their pit features with a particular, it works the same as straw, as a form of straw on the outside, but in this particular case, it probably is producing high levels of CO2 as the lining is deteriorating. So in this particular case, you're creating an oxygen-deprived environment inside of a pit because of the lining deteriorating. There's no reason to suggest that our Neolithic cousins, who were bright, bright creatures, weren't doing similar things. Whether it's mixing of commodities, whether it's lining of some form, these are bright individuals. Bottom line is that we have to rethink what we think as we talk about storage in some capacity. So let's think about this. Here's an example from Chatham. And Kathy and Amy are going to have to forgive me because I don't remember where I stole this particular illustration from. It was early morning as I was putting it together. But thinking in terms of these, of being baskets or storage areas that have gone off. These are the containers within the refrigerator that are no longer viable. Maybe you can take it outside and feed it to your goats and sheep and something else, but you're not going to feed it to your kids. On the other hand, you have other ones that are mid-zone and versus those that are good. That's what's happening ethnographically. That's what we have to think about, and that is people who come into this storage room, as they're selecting food, they're saying, whoops, we better get this one eaten really, really quickly because there's only a week left before it turns into food for the pig or food to some other animal. There's a management that's taking place and thinking about it on a daily basis. This is a paper, if you're interested, much of what I just talked about comes from this. You can see why I use refrigerators as a metaphor. In this particular case, I called it the Neolithic refrigerator on a Friday night to try and think about some of the different pieces and how that may fit together in some form. Right, let's think about seasonal stresses and let's think about multi-year storage planning. Storage planning is about seasons, and it's about seasons of plenty and how you manage that. These are just a few of the extensive literature that's emerging from all kinds of different places. Here's one that Barbara and company have developed here, the seasonal and the material. Another one in terms of medieval and early modern countrysides. Hunter-gatherer work, excellent piece of work by David Yesner. The archaeology of seasonality. This is a topic that this is David Yesner, who's sort of on the cusp of this, was in 1995, if I recall correctly. These other ones are much more recent. It's engaging with the whole concept, again, of seasonality, thinking about people moving through space. And not just people moving through space, but how you deal with stresses in some capacity. I want to drill down on that a little bit further and think about this in some form. This is a piece of research that I did back with an apprentice back in 2004, thinking about salmon and thinking about plants in British Columbia, Canada, with complex foragers. And this is one way to think about it, and that is, when you think from the ground up, you have to ask the question, what's going on seasonally? You have to ask, when are plants and animals available, and how did people deal with it? In this particular case, it's a chart here that thinks in terms of months of the year, going from November, December, down to October. So thinking about it in such a way where availability of subsistence resources going from high to low, and how you have periods, in the center you can see here, periods where you have the depletion of winter food, and then you have periods under which you're more likely to have seasonal stresses. Then you have new foods coming back online, spring vegetables in some form, salmon eventually becoming available, and so that you have different things that are taking place at different points of the year. Ultimately, you're really dealing with three variables, and it's playing with these three variables to try and create a sustainable approach to this. And the variables, which should be no surprise to you, is that of fats, protein, and carbohydrates, and how you play with those to maximize things. What we know from this context, interestingly enough, is that there's certain times of the year, and this great piece of work by John Speth is an exploration of this that I nudge you towards if you're interested in this kind of topic. And that is, there's certain times of the year you can be eating as much deer as you want, you hunt, but Bambi's not going to help you. In the long term, you're getting lots of protein, but at certain times of the year, it's incredibly lean. If you don't have carbohydrates to go with it, if you don't have fats to go with it to complement it in some form, you're going to be in big trouble. And we see this in lots of different hunter-gatherer complex contexts in different places in the world. So there is some fascinating dimensions to this that we're only starting to pull out apart. It means we have to think, though, in terms of yearly planning and availability. This is a piece thinking more towards the Neolithic, and this comes from an article that I just published last November. This is a piece of work thinking about it in terms of larger villages in the southern Levant and what's going on seasonally. I'm using colors here in a sneaky way to say green equals things are going just great. Red is where things are likely to be high risk, and blue is where you're kind of balancing things out in some form. And again, this isn't a point of thinking about what's going on seasonally in terms of planting things, harvesting things, storing commodities in some form, eventually using those in some form, and hanging on until spring when new vegetables show up, new plants show up, when you can get animals that are no longer lean, that there's some protein involved in them. Now, this is just thinking, this is largely thinking in terms of plants, but also trying to layer in some aspects to fatty meat and how that may be involved in this in some form. I'm going to be candid with you, and that is I do not have a deep understanding of plant and animal caloric payoff on a seasonal level. This is one of the few attempts, even if it's somewhat amateurish, this is one of the few attempts to try and think synthetically about the sort of the planning that might be going on in different seasons. What really needs to take place here is basically getting our good colleagues who do plants, our good colleagues who do animals, not only in terms of ecology, but also that of sort of caloric payoff, nutritional payoff in different forms, sitting down, thinking together, and thinking about what's taking place for different points of the Neolithic. This is going to be totally different from the early village context of Göbekli Tepe. This is going to be totally different from what's taking place in the Pottery Neo. The thing is, we need to get to that point. This is a beautiful master's thesis waiting for somebody to basically model what's taking place at multiple stages, even in one particular area, Southern Levant, Anatolia, it doesn't make any difference. This is the kind of thing that researchers have yet to do, and yet we really need to start thinking about this. If I had the choice to go and do one particular piece of research, we all think about sort of pet projects. The archaeology of fat would be a great topic in terms of trying to think about what's going on in terms of subsistence practices at different points of time. So we need to think in terms of what's going on seasonally. Drilling down from the work of Barbara and others, we need to think in terms of what's going on that really short-term standpoint. Now, here's the other part in terms of storage. And that is, we don't, as I just mentioned to you, ethnographic research demonstrates people in the past or present today, or farmers today, they don't think about a single year. They don't think in terms of seasonality as a single year, such as I've just illustrated. Instead, they think about multiple years. As part of that, you have to understand that there's a calculation that's taking place. Farmers today are some of the most statistically, mathematically inclined people that I know. And that is, they have to understand markets, they have to understand production, and they have to understand how it fits together. And here's, I think, an example of our colleagues in the past. And that is, if we think in terms of multiple years, if we think of 24 months, which I think is in some ways conservative, then the calculation for this involves thinking about how much seed do you need to hold back for planting for the next year. You need to think in terms of how much seed is likely to be spoiled when it goes into storage. You also have to calculate that we are not entirely efficient energetic machines. Human consumption is at best about 85%. So there's also this dimension in terms of what's taking place. The other part to it, and this is one of the big nasty words as far as I'm concerned, surplus is a word that's overused, especially when we talk about later periods. It's not understood when we use it, and it's also used in such a way that is really not thinking about what's an excess. An excess is something that's beyond normal use. You're still probably going to hang on to it. So what does that mean? Here's a little piece of modeling to try and think about this. So we're archaeologists. We deal with data points. One of the data points we deal with, number of pits. whether we're talking about an example from here, Iron Age pit, here, series of pits and various features, American Southwest, series of pit features and residential buildings. We have hundreds and hundreds of different examples from different places. The assumption here is, of course, more pits equal more food, equals, and that's when we have those conversations about surplus, emerging social inequality, all the elements that are layered onto this. But these are nothing more than empty refrigerators. And we model them as essentially being full all the time. Yes, that's an overgeneralization, and some of my colleagues are not going to be pleased with that, but that's kind of the way we approach it. Here's the challenge. If we hypothetically, and I'll show you this column right here, right up above, where you can see the number 100. If we assume that we need 100 units per person, it doesn't matter what the commodity is, and it doesn't matter to me whether you're talking about a caloric yield of 1,200 calories on plants, and then let's say there's another 1,200 that comes from animals or comes from immediate form. If you're envisioning it that you need 100 units of stored plants in some form, okay? So let's just take that as a starting point. Given what's taking place in terms of you hold back 15% of seeds for next year, you then realize that you have a loss rate. If you go with an estimate of 20% or 35%, this is what it means for a single, if you want to have 100 units by the end of the year. So basically to get through, to make yourself happy. Not 105 where you've got an excess, but 100 units, all right? It means that you need 115, 138, and 155. So if you need 100 pits or 100 units, doesn't matter, you need 155 of those to make a go of it. What do you need if you're thinking about 1 year's reserve? Now you need 270. Now you need 310. What if you're thinking about moderate risk of 2 years? It means you need to have 400. You need to have 465. That's suggesting that when we say, oh, there's a lot of pits here, probably not a lot of pits. Now, that's just food storage. That's not fresh. That's not the rest of it. But it should cause us to re-engage and think about some of those different dimensions in some form. That one's in 2017, if you want to go take a look at it and sort of try and pull it apart. Either way, what it means is that we need to re-engage with our assumptions of that we have lots of pits, and therefore we have lots of food to make ourselves happy in some form. Here's another interesting part to it, and that is we don't spend time, we're not spending time thinking in terms of caloric compatibility, even in terms of plants. So different, and this is again coming from wonderful resources, barley, emmer wheat, lentils, horse beans, they do very different things for the body. They also have different storage capacities. They have caloric yield. They have total energy yield, which you can calculate in terms of meters cubed. Total energy use at 85%. You can walk through these things. And these show you, we can use these to generate estimates in terms of caloric yield for different populations, different scale populations. The other part to it, which we have really no understanding of, is how does that change when you're going with one container of 100% emmer wheat versus a container that has a combination of lentils, emmer wheat, maybe something else, maybe some other pea or something. We don't know what's going on in terms of preservation, long-term shelf life, and we also understand what that means in terms of what's going to go on in terms of the human body. We need to understand that. Here's another little piece. This is one that's unpublished, but I'm going to share with you anyways. And that is thinking in terms of, this is a chart that I did a number of years ago, looking at storage volume. This is Southern Levant, looking at the late Natufian to the LPPNB, looking at number of months of storage that potentially offers as a 50% emmer and barley combination, number of months. And the argument I'm going to make here is really, it's only when you get to the LPPNB and perhaps to the middle PPNB that really we have a significant food excess. That shouldn't surprise us. It's just a different way to come at this problem in some form. So when we have conversations, sort of these surprise conversations of, we don't have much in the way of social inequality that's showing up at Chattahoyuk. Well, of course not. You don't have some of these components that we assume are already there. We just don't have that, I don't think. Okay, I want to move on briefly here to thinking in terms of evolutionary bending of daily practices. And here I want to give a shout out to Kathy Twist and company, who I've sort of shamelessly adapted this idea from, and also expanded it in a more recent paper, and thinking about daily practices rather than the sudden evolutionary invention of agriculture in some capacity. Here's where my thinking is with a lot of these different pieces, and I'll just roll these up in some capacity. And that is, I think as researchers, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're talking about long-term evolutionary changes, and we don't understand how this is connected to daily practices and small-scale changes that are taking place. We need to think about that. We need to think about this. So if one wants to think in terms of, and these are ideas that were just drafted up, so please, this was literally this morning. So please be gentle on me with this one. If you want to think in terms of shifting daily practices, we can think about small-scale drivers such as living closer together in villages, better plant storage methods, increased community rituals, basically coming together in some form. If those are the kinds of changes we see taking place, and these can be very minimal, there are outcomes that are both intentional and immediate, and there's also outcomes that are unintentional and delayed. And we can think about how do we pull those apart in terms of things of increased food security with better plant storage, reorganization of labor, new systems of property, potentially new forms of rights and ownership. We can think in terms of that of living closer together in villages. Both you have protection with more people living there, but you can also make the argument that that is potentially resulting in poorer health conditions in the long term, infectious diseases, people living with animals and stock. So there are unintended outcomes from this. There's also, in terms of an archaeological standpoint, there's also other longer term changes that we can see coming out, including things such as that of increased segmentation within human communities. We can think in terms of diverse Neolithic landscape. The point I want to make to you here is that we're on the cusp of trying to think about some of these. And we need to spend more time thinking from the grassroots in terms of daily life and how these have roll-ons, either intentional or unintentional, in some capacity. It ultimately means we have to think, at least partially, of the Neolithic being a wonderful accident and thinking about the human work that sort of creates this. Here I want to give a shout out to a really interesting little piece of work done by Bonnie. This most recent work of hers called The Domestication of Rock, which is her PhD thesis out of Helsinki. And it's one of looking at different systems of plasterware and pottery and thinking in terms of a piece of work that also looks at different materials used as you're thinking about plasterware, gypsum versus lime plaster. The point to all of this is that these are potentially making for small-scale advantages. That is, greater breathability, limited water penetration. This is the kind of thing where different materials have the potential to create a better system for food storage. It may only be 2%, but from an evolutionary standpoint, that is a real advantage. So this is the kind of work that's helping us think about some of the shorter term decision makings and how some of the longer term implications may roll on in some form. Here's another piece to it, and that is we need to spend more time thinking about the household and thinking about essentially laborscapes and thinking about how this involves people in different contexts. So things such as a simple family in some capacity, and this is a Turkish ethnographic context behind, where we have seasonal use of labor with friends and other individuals. We have to think in terms of these networks, not just the kind of excellent work that's taking place with networks at Chatal and other places, but we have to think in terms of what kind of networks are taking place in a synchronic level. We have to scale away from just this diachronic change, thinking about this in terms of networks in the long term, and we have to think in terms of essentially contemporary communities and how this may have resulted in different laborscapes in some form. The big thing that I'm going to sort of move to is really here, I'll think about evolutionary slow cooking. Thinking about a series of stages and series of moments where we're thinking about carrying capacity and we're thinking about population aggregation. And the argument that I'm going to make to you is that in many ways, we can think about low-level plant management, immediate consumption as being something that's more typical of earlier points. This is a horrible evolutionary diagram, but it is one that is convenient to explain sort of this overall trajectory. Then thinking about new technologies and reduced harvest loss that's taking place. Thinking about increased plant management. And I always know when this is a successful talk because everybody's heads are turning sideways like this to try and figure out what exactly is being written here, including my own, by the way. And then thinking about some of these arguments for potentially differential authority and rank and these kinds of things. But the bottom line is that we have to think about these as layers that are taking place, not just a moment under which domesticated animals are showing up or something similar. We have to think about it in terms of human agency and how this is bringing about changes in different forms. Let me sort of bring this to a close and thinking about some of the highlights of some of the different pieces here. The big argument that I'm going to make is that in many ways, as you see in the titles up above, I think when we step back, what's really going on is that people at different points are adopting different systems of organizing basically risk management and thinking about how you minimize risk management in terms of what I've called community co-insurance versus that of household self-insurance. I think that's what's going on. I've written before about changes in the household itself, going from extended to nucleated, all these things. Yes, that is true, I think, but I think the big thing that's driving some of this is that human communities are thinking in terms of how do you minimize risk at certain points. And I think that's what's taking place, whether it's through storage, whether it's through plant management, whether it's laborscapes, that ultimately we need to think in terms of how is co-insurance disappearing to self-insurance and basically going from community level to that of household level in some capacity. This comes from that same publication, 2025, and thinking about really the kind of blending at some point, this sort of transition from risk management strategies that are going from co-insurance to self-insurance, and how this is sort of taking place in a way that connects together with utilization of wild versus domesticated, thinking in terms of mortuary practices, in terms of community cohesion, and thinking in terms of the sort of relationship between delayed and immediate consumption. Now again, these are arrows, they overlap, it varies enormously between sites and periods of time. The bottom line is trying to think in terms of how are people organizing risk management in some capacity. Why is this important? I think the big thing comes down to carrying capacity. And that is, as researchers, you would be super hard pressed to find a piece of research that's recent that deals with carrying capacity. This is one of the critical ones from '76. If carrying capacity is envisioned as this moment under which you have caloric needs, population levels, sustainability, resilience all coming together in some capacity, it's the interplay between the number of mammals that need food and the amount of food that's available in some capacity. We know very little about this, and yet we need to understand this, especially given if we're asking the question of how many people lived at Chathal, how much food was necessary, what is a viable community in some capacity. We need to think about that relationship. But as Neolithic scholars, we're really not writing about it in some form. Here's another element that we're not thinking about, and that is we're not thinking about how Neolithic health is related to intergenerational food insecurity and self-insurance. Yes, we have excellent work, Larson, Chris Knuzel, a whole bunch of other researchers that are doing excellent work that are thinking in terms of what diseases are showing up, what does the dentition tell us, all these different pieces, but we're not really thinking about it from the standpoint of intergenerational stress, which we now know with lots of research in terms of refugee populations and other groups. This is a major thing. This is passed on epigenetically. So there are elements to this that we need to think about in terms of yearly stress, food stress at different points, and what that 2% can do in terms of some of these different communities. Here's the other one, thinking in terms of Malthusian modeling. Here's a very simple one, published no, this is not simple. This is excellent piece of work, but it's essentially one of statistical modeling that looks at age-specific survivorship, population age, structure, total size, labor availability, food caloric available, food ratio, and bam, they publish all kinds of great statistics that come out. Now, the challenge here is, and this is where we are not being good scholars as Neolithic researchers. The challenge here is that the numbers we're giving them, 3,000 to 5, let alone 5 to 8, they pump these numbers in to their mathematical formulas and kick things out. We're not thinking in terms of what that means in terms of the long term. So we're agents of chaos in our own way, in so many different ways. Okay, so let me just very quickly sort of wrap this up in some form. First of all, I think that increasingly, as time goes on, I think that Neolithic communities were much smaller than we've originally believed. And I think that this is one of the big dimensions to this. I think the argument of early urbanism, at least in terms of the pre-Potter Neolithic, I think that's horribly overstated. I think we're missing the boat on that. And I'd make arguments that in terms of Potter Neolithic, we're searching for a frame that helps us in terms of grant agencies. We're not necessarily advancing a conversation in terms of what is early urbanism in some capacity. We need to understand carrying capacity and risk. We need to re-engage with that and think in terms of what's the big planning picture? What were they doing at different points of time? Food storage is critical, but we don't talk about it as scholars. And here I'm going to give you a very specific example where both Barbara and I don't know about any other audience members here, were at the Neolithic Congress in Turkey in December of 2024. And it turns out that the word storage is used once. There was what, 1,200 papers, presentations, maybe even more. I think the number of them. The word storage, I went through last night, the word storage, be it in a title or in terms of the text, even the abstracts, the keywords, the word storage is used once. And, lovely enough, it's by a Japanese research group who's working on the Bronze Age. So I can't think of a better demonstration that Neolithic scholars are not talking about storage when you get your 1,200 abstracts dealing with the Neolithic, which is somehow the height of food production and early domestication and this Neolithic Revolution, and we use the word once. That says an awful lot. Last thing here, this whole argument of sort of rapid, progressive improvement, B. Gordon Child, etc. I think that's a time frame that if you want to talk about thousands of years, if you want to talk about broad evolutionary sequencing, fine. But in the short term, it was unintentional, and it's a ratcheting up of what was taking place. Okay, I've been running on long. I much appreciate your time. As you can tell, I've been wrestling with a lot of ideas that are still very cloudy in my own mind.